People who call themselves white nationalists, that's a problematic term. That is something I tend to notice. I notice really problematic words that are bad and you shouldn't use. Racism is one of them, and white nationalism is one of them. Right? Supremacism is another one. It's very, they throw this term around, like what does that mean? Okay. But you have these people. Now, I personally believe that this was a plant. I don't have any evidence of this, but my conspiracy theory is that these guys in North Dakota who went off to make white-only township, that they were not maybe some of them or all of them, but that they're kind of a controlled opposition. There may have been some, Searchlight or Antifa or whatever infiltrators who convinced a bunch of particularly dumb neo-Nazi types to go off and form their own township. In response which there was, of course, a mass mobbing of the township. There are 4 Native Americans in the mobbing, but and so they get all sorts of, media attention and stuff. But really, it was the white people in the area who were mobbing this little, Nazi town. And so someone who supports free association understands the problem with that, right? Basically, you're not allowed to go to your area and do your own thing, right? You're not allowed to go and form your own area and just live, right? That's not allowed, right? So the essentially tyrannical nature, I think, is put on full display in this little township. Now, maybe they could say, well, they had Nazi symbols and swastikas and stuff, and so therefore they had a desire to kill other people or something or other. I mean, it's really tenuous because first off, I mean, we're not dealing in practical things. We're not dealing in practically what a group of people is going to be able to do. Okay, what you're dealing with is kind of an intent thing, right? Oh, well, they have an intent to go kill a whole bunch of people. Well, do they? And of course, the double standard of this is like you never see this kind of outrage, and when you have blacks who say, this is a black neighborhood, white people get out. If a white person tries to walk through, they'll get the crap beat out of them because this is a black area, right? There's no real concern about that. That's not a real there's no outrage in regards to that. It's only when white people do it, right? So there's that clear double standard there, right? In the Middle East, there's a clear double standard. Saudi Arabia has laws regarding non-Muslims. I probably should have looked that up. But anyway, in Saudi Arabia, it's illegal to preach Christianity in Saudi Arabia. So basically, and of course, there's a Sharia law. If you're a woman, you get raped. You go to prison because in order for there to be rape, you need to have 3 male witnesses or something ridiculous like that. So Saudi Arabia is allowed to do that. Saudi Arabia is allowed to basically prohibit people to prohibit people of certain faiths from coming into Saudi Arabia. Afghanistan, for example, almost killed a guy who converted to Christianity, but then they said, but then they just settled for deportation because the U.S. was there, and they didn't. And that would be kind of a difficult situation. The U.S. propping up that regime that would do things like that. So you have this double standard, right? You have a clear double standard, right? You have Saudi Arabia is allowed to discriminate against other religious groups, right? And to varying degrees of severity, force them to be Muslims or make them pay for not being Muslim. And if Israel ever tries to do that, well, that's that's evil. That's evil Zionist totalitarianism, whatever. Israel made a few mistakes. Okay, there was a period when Israel controlled the Sinai, the Golan Heights, and all of what is today Israel. And during that period, right after the war, they could have said non-Jews out, right? Just non-Jews out, including the Sinai. Right? Non-Jews out, just none. We're not dealing with it. You have your countries, right? And that's something that average people need to figure out, is that multinational things don't work like things don't coexist. That's a good way to look at it. Things generally don't coexist. Eventually one comes to dominate the other. Okay, coexistence is not something that really happens. Religious freedom and tolerance in an area, right, is what, right, when you allow religious freedom and tolerance in an area, what you end up having is multiple religions. So now you basically created multiple religious nations to varying degrees of severity. Some people are more secular than others. Some people take it really seriously, right? So there's, not everyone is like a robot in this, but when you have religious tolerance, well, now you've created multiple religious nations, and when you create multiple religious nations, well, now you have different views that inform policy, right? Economic policy in terms of Islamic views of banking and such, views of women, right? That's an obvious example. Okay, and interestingly, like, different religions can have different views of religious freedom, right? Islam, for example, is not a big fan of religious freedom. Wants everyone to be forced to be Muslim, right? And so basically you've balkanized your country when you have religious freedom. Okay, so now you've balkanized your country. The way you get out of this problem of balkanization is either you snap them back to a single religion, a single identity, which is going to involve convert or die at the sword, right? Back to the Middle Ages again, right? We're going to have to do some of that, or you're going to have to keep them separated. You're going to have to break it up, the country into multiple countries. Right? Those are the two real. There's a third option, which is anarchism, but I'm not. Who cares? Those are the two real options, right? Either homogeneity by force or separate them, and so, right. And there's also another. I guess you could say there's a third option, which is simmer, which is just sit in the shit for a long time, just sit in the shit indefinitely. Like the United States, for example, medical policy in the United States makes no sense. Either a universal healthcare system or a free market system would be better. Either would be better than what currently exists. What currently exists is not a result of a coherent ideological group trying to do what's best for them. It's a mishmash of interests. It's making sausage. Right? You have Group A wants something, Group B wants something, Group C wants something, and they all duke it out. They battle and compromise, and they create crap. It's kind of like mixing colors in a canvas, right? Well, little kids thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to mix purple and green and red and blue and yellow. I'm going to mix all the colors, and we're going to have the most beautiful thing. We're going to have true indigo. No, you're not. You're going to have brown. And that's what happens when you mix all the colors. And you see a similar thing in terms of the policy of the United States when you mix multiple nationalities. Nationalities on the basis of race, nationalities on the basis of religion, nationalities on the basis of economic ideology. Those are the three main identity groups. Okay, because you have the progressives and conservatives, and then you have the new Europeans, and you have the new Africans, and you have the Aztlan peoples, and then you can have religion. You have the Mormon type people. You have the Baptist, various other Protestant denomination fundamentalists. I don't think there's really much to say of a Catholic fundamentalist movement in the U.S. So we have a situation in the United States, and we have to ask the question, well, how bad does it have to get before we break up the United States? And that's and people who are still have like drunk the Kool-Aid, the idea of breaking up the U.S., for them, it's an if question, if it will happen, if it should happen, right? When in reality, it's a when question, right? I mean, it's really, okay, how long do you want to put off breaking up the U.S.? How bad do things have to get before we partition the United States into sensible countries that correspond with the true nationalities that live in the United States empire? The longer we put it off, the harder it's going to be, the more difficult the adjustment is going to be. Okay, so it's not if, okay, it's coming. Okay, it's when. It's when and on what terms. Especially for people on the right, well, the more you put off breaking up the U.S., the worse terms you're going to get. Right? Do it now. There's no better time than now. Right? And in the situation, for example, of Israel and Israel kicking out the Palestinians, well, look, people who oppose that, people who oppose Israel doing what it does, taking land and kicking out the former inhabitants, well, that's what any new state does. Right? That's what Aztlan will have to do. That's what New Africa will have to do. That's what New Europe will have to do. That's what the Mormon states will have to do. Right? To a lesser degree, that's what the conservative and the progressive states of America are going to have to do if they come to pass. Right? They're going to have to say, all right, you know. Now, ideally, what we could do is we could get voting records. Right? We could and I'm sure they have them. I mean, legally they're not supposed to have them, but I'm sure they have voting records, so we can see how people voted and use that to say, all right, you voted this way this many times. Okay, you're out. You're deported based on your votes back when the United States was a single country. All right, and that would be good, because you don't want people. You don't want like a secret progressive in conservative land saying, oh, I'm a conservative, just because he doesn't want to leave, right? Just because he doesn't want to leave, his area and his job or whatever. Say, no, this is not your nation, out, right? And that's what Israel should have done. But they didn't do that. They instead chose to give back the Sinai. They gave up the West Bank. They gave up the Gaza Strip. And now Israel itself, the remaining, this truncated, shriveled remain of Israel, is only 70% Jewish. And they brought in a bunch of Ethiopian refugees. Why? Why would you do that? What fucking morons! And of course, they initially tried to integrate them, and the results of that were predictable. And so now they're instituting anti-race mixing laws, which is of course just making them look awful. In fact, I saw this post by. It was a big blog. It wasn't just some random blogger guy. But anyway, they were talking about how the Israelis were oppressing the blacks just like the Southerners in the U.S. were oppressing the blacks. Oh, look. Racist Israelis. Like, well, the Israelis brought them in on the assumption that Ethiopians were just like them, that they could integrate into Israeli society and they could be, productive members, right? That's why they brought them in the first place, okay? But then that obviously didn't happen. It never does. It didn't for Sweden, it doesn't for Finland, it doesn't for Germany, France. To a degree it does with Britain, but Britain, for whatever reason, Britain is getting really, really high IQ black people from the Caribbean and Africa. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's their policy. Maybe they require a college degree, which slightly selects for higher IQ. On the aggregate, I don't put a whole lot of stock into college degrees, but it will select for slightly higher IQ. Fine. But I mean, in the United States, Canada, it's the same story, right? So why the Israelis thought, oh, we'll bring in some Ethiopians and they'll integrate into Israeli society and it'll be a great PR thing, I guess. Maybe that's what they were thinking. I don't know. But whatever they were thinking, it was a disaster because now they have a bunch of blacks in their country. Okay, and they said, well, we don't want miscegenation here because that's going to chop off the Jewish population. Also, especially people in like the Middle East and in the Balkans. They'll say things like, yeah, I don't like seeing my people race mix, especially with blacks, because it's just icky, right? And they'll say that, and people in parts of the world, that weren't part of the West, really, they'll just say these things like bluntly and straight up, right? And I think, and the Israel is not part of the West. It's very connected to the West. It deals with the West a lot, but the mentality of these people, for example, they don't allow marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew in Israel, okay? And the reason for that is, well, we want to keep the faith, right? They don't allow, and they have segregated schools with the Ethiopians now. But David Duke, for example, he came on and he said, talked about how Israel had a law preventing marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew, and how that was so bad. Well, that's, that's obvious hypocrisy. Like, wouldn't New Europe have such laws? Well, wouldn't it? Like, and for the people who, and a lot of people say that I'm like, for example, Newman said I'm against race mixing or something. It's like, no, I'm not. Like the whole world allows race mixing, right? I mean, people who want to marry a black person, like they can go do it in Britain, they can do it in France, they can do it, if the US was partitioned, they could do it in basically every other country in the US, maybe not Aztlan, maybe not New Africa, but they could do it in Canada, they could do it, like it's such a narrow-minded idea, to say that, for example, Israel needs to allow marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Look, Jews and non-Jews can marry anywhere else in the world. They can do it. They can do it in Lebanon. Okay, they can do it in Cyprus. Okay, they can do it in Turkey. Anywhere in the world, they can do it. Okay, Israel is not a big country. Basically, what Israel does by not allowing marriage between Jews and non-Jews, they're not denying marriage between Jews and non-Jews. They're denying marriage between Jews and non-Jews in this little strip of land on the world. That's all they're denying. They're not denying it categorically worldwide. There's plenty of places for you to go and do that, okay? There's not plenty of places on the planet where you have a Jewish majority area and a Jewish controlled state. Not Jewish influenced, where you have these and real Jewish nationalists. sees a bunch of Jews influencing things in the U.S. or in Britain and in all these countries, okay, whatever. What good does that do to the rank and file, Jew bag of donuts? Nothing. It does nothing good for him. All right. In fact, these people, these elite liberal Jews, are often anti-Israel. They're anti-Jewish nationalism, right? So fuck them. Like they're not helping Israel. They're not helping the nationalist Jews in Israel, right? Fuck them. And so, that's kind of a situation that rank and file, European Americans face, is that they say, oh, look at all these white people in positions of power. Like, okay, well, fuck them. Fuck. Oh, so basically, like, Noam Chomsky is white or something, or like George Bush was white, Oh, well, gee, so that makes it okay now that he, lets in a bajillion mestizos, whatever, and does nothing on Obama has done more. I mean, and Obama has done very, very little, but even Obama has done more in terms of deporting illegals than Bush ever did. Right? And so we could say, oh, well, geez, so Bush is doing it, a white guy's doing it. Oh, that makes it okay. Like, no, it's not, that it's not us, right? And, we see, for example, like a real European, a new European person sees all these white people, all these banksters crashing global economies, taking money for themselves. Okay, that doesn't help us at all financially. Like, it doesn't help the typical white person financially, okay? And it makes white people look bad because, he looks like you. He's the kind of person who looks like you doing these awful things. Mass theft, and to a lesser degree, mass murder, right? And these are white males doing it, right? And we oppose it. I oppose it. You oppose it, right? But like, and these white males who are doing all these horrible things then, rage against European racial separatism. It's ridiculous, right? And that's a situation that the Jews in Israel face. They have these Jews in all these countries around the world, pushing just cultural Marxist filth on the people in those countries, wrecking the financial institutions, giving Jews a royally bad name, and to a degree, that's taken out on Israel a bit. But it makes Israel's job harder, because Israel's not doing that. Israel is not wrecking the global banking system. Okay, Israel is a Jewish country, and they made a stupid move in choosing that to be Israel. They could have had large swathes of Madagascar, large swathes of Tanzania, large swathes of Brazil. Right, those were three options that they had, but they chose the area. They chose the Levant, right, because that's where a bunch of their holy sites were. That was like the return, the prophecy, and all that crap. Okay, and they're paying a very, very heavy price for that bullshit. In fact, I think the price is so high it's going to be the end of Israel, because I think Jews are going to become a minority in Israel in maybe about 50 years. I think Jews will be a minority in Israel. I say 50 to be safe. I think it'll be before that, but in at least in no more than 50 years, Jews are going to be a minority in Israel, and that'll be it. Right, the Jewish nature of the state will be gone. It will no longer be a Jewish state. It'll be just another crapshoot state. Right, and it's going to have multiple nationalities. Multiple nationalities under one political unit. The policy of the country is going to become more and more incoherent because it's not right. Like universal health care versus free market health care. Both are better than a mixture of the two. Right? Let me say that again. Universal health care and total free market health care both are better than a mixture of the two. Right? Nothing's worse than the mix. Right? Right? The mixed economies, mixed like that's the worst. It's like mixing colors. What you get is brown. So white nationalists who are anti-Israel, I guess they talk about some of the things the Israelis do to the Palestinians or the Gaza Strip, and these takes on this podcast are starting to run together. So I apologize if I already said that, but that's sideline talk. Like, let's say you have someone come in, fire a missile at you, and then you respond by firing 10 missiles. Okay, so that's overkill. Well, what was 9/11? 2,500 people died, so now you go to the Middle East and kill 2.5 million. Right? So you want to talk overkill, right? Israel's doing nothing. Look at what the U.S. did in response to 9/11. Okay, you want to talk about overkill? And the idea, of course, is to hit back harder than they hit you, so they'll stop firing little rockets or whatever, or bombs or whatever. Now, what some people can say is they can say, well, Israel maybe you can bring up some examples where the Israelis really are treating the Palestinians unfairly, right? You could, for example, maybe you can say, well, the settlements in the West Bank, that's an unfair thing. Okay, well, there's one way that they're, but remember, the Israelis could have pushed them out of Israel completely. In the year 1967, Israel had an opportunity to do that. Right after the war, they could have said, Palestinians out, kick them all out, force deported all of them, right? The dead enders, the holdouts, put bullets in their heads, and that would have been it, right? And then today, they would have have a policy, no non-Jewish citizens, no non-Jewish immigrants, okay? It would be a 100 Jewish states, a 100% Jewish state whose western border was the Suez Canal, right? And it would be all Jewish, and they wouldn't have these problems. They wouldn't have this festering sore of the West Bank or Gaza, because they wouldn't be there. They would be gone. They would be pushed. They would have been pushed into the desert 50 years ago. That's where they would be. Okay? But Israel instead chose to give land. They chose to compromise, and now they're paying the price. They're paying a very heavy, very deadly price for it. Right? Here's another kind of example of that. Roughly as many black slaves were sent. In fact, it was a bit more, but it was over a longer period of time. But we'll just say for simplicity, roughly equal amount of black slaves went to the Arab world as went to the Americas. Now, it was over a longer period of time. The American slave trade went from like 1500 to 1800, whereas the Arab slave trade went from like 700 all the way up to to 1800, which was the British ban on slavery. So, but it was about the same number, okay? Now, the reason that the Arab world doesn't face the odium of mass slavery is because the Arab world killed all of the blacks who came in. All the black slaves who came in, the males were castrated and the females were not allowed to breed, and they were often, in fact, used as wet nurses for Arab children. Okay. In the Americas, of course, the black slaves were allowed to breed, they were allowed to survive, and so they continued to live. Right? They weren't all killed. And because they weren't all killed, well, they're here to remember the injustice and complain. Some grievances legitimate, some grievances just overshooting for power. Right? But the Arab world doesn't have that problem because they don't have any blacks. At least not many. Israel, if it was 100% Israel, if they chose to not compromise and chose to instead be assholes, they'd have an all-Jewish state, right? Which went to the Suez Canal. It would be 100% Jewish, and they wouldn't have these Palestinians in there, right? Doing these things. They wouldn't be sending tanks into Hamas stronghold areas. They wouldn't be doing that. They wouldn't have to do that, okay? Because they wouldn't be there, right? And as a result, Israel would have a much better public image because it wouldn't have this festering minority groups which it was quote unquote oppressing, right? Similarly, if the United States in the year 1865 massacred every single black person in the United States, right? There would be some odium at the moment, but fast forward to the year 1965, it would be forgotten, right? You wouldn't have segregation. There wouldn't be segregation, right? If the whites in the United States chose to kill all of the Africans in the right after the Civil War, there wouldn't be segregation. There would be the odium of Jim Crow, right? Because there would be none, and that's and that's the great thing about a homogenous country is that you don't have these other groups, right? These other groups who come in and either are oppressed or pretend to be oppressed or some mixture of the two. Usually it's some mixture of the two, right? For South Africa is another great example. Let the blacks in. If South Africa instead from the outset said no blacks in this country, we may have to settle for a smaller country as a result, but that's fine. White only. Even if it means a smaller country, we're going to have an enclave that's going to be white only. And if they did that to this day, there'd be a white only country, right? They wouldn't have apartheid, right? And they wouldn't have all the farm killings. Okay? Don't mix political units. Israel is a good country in this regard. Israel is a good example of ethnic nationalism. Now you could say that maybe that they're Jews and there's some Jews in the U.S. who support cultural Marxism but also support Israel. Okay, fine, whatever. I mean, that's a bit hypocritical of them to support Israel while supporting cultural Marxism. I get that. That is hypocritical of them. But that's not. But the Jewish state of Israel is not doing that. Okay, and David Duke railing against the injustices of Israel Israel, he basically wants a white Israel, and so do I. Well, I wouldn't be so dogmatic about what land we get, right? Whereas the Israelis, because of their religion, they were kind of dogmatic about what land they got, and they chose some pretty crappy land when they could have gotten better land that would have been less of an imposition on other groups. Right? For example, taking land in Brazil would have been much less of an imposition on other groups. But that happened. There's not much we can say about it at this point. And that's what Zionism is. It's a homeland for their group and for European racial identity people. How they could oppose Israel while wanting basically the same thing for their group is just amazingly hypocritical once you spell it out. Perhaps they're just kind of blind. I think that may be what it is. They're just kind of blind. Or maybe they, recognize that the Zionists that the Zionists are hypocritical, that the Zionists oppose European racial separatism while demanding it for their own kind. I don't know if that's true. If you went into Israel and asked them if there should, if white people should have a white-only country like Israel, right, or like Israel was intended to be from the outset, what do you think the results would be? If you framed it in that way, I think it would be very difficult for them to oppose it. So that's all I wanted to say. In the main, and look, every country does shitty things, right? Every country is going to do shitty things. I get that. Okay, but in the main, I support Israel, basically just as a Jewish state, right? Israel needs to get its act together, needs to figure out what it is. It's a Jewish state. It's not a multicultural state. It's not going to ingratiate itself to the world by becoming multicultural. So maybe Israel has to amputate again in order to maintain a 95% Jewish region, right? Maybe that's what it's going to be. Maybe it's going to have to be another amputation, another territory loss. Hopefully that would be the last one, but I think that's what it's going to be. I think they're going to, because they lost the Gaza Strip, they lost the West Bank, and now they're only 70%, so I think they're going to have to amputate about 30% of their territory, deport, they're going to have to homogenize the two regions now, so now it's going to be 3 states. There's going to be the West Bank and Gaza, and then there's going to be this third multicultural Palestine area with the Ethiopians and other religious groups, and then there's going to be the Jewish area, right? And they lost a lot of land by being stupid. They lost a lot of land by thinking, oh, we're going to compromise with these people, we're going to come to a 2-state solution. Yeah. and that's just the price. That's the price that they're going to have to pay for being stupid. Or if they double down on stupid and choose to maintain the territorial extent of Israel as it is, well, then the Jews are going to become a minority in that territorial extent, and that's the price they're going to pay. So, and that's really what it is. So the parallels are amazingly obvious between New Europe and Israel. And the problems that Israel faces are almost identical to the problems that European countries today face and New Europe will face in spades. So the opposition to Israel by white nationalists is just really is really dumb, really hypocritical, and I think that the claim that Zionists, quote unquote, this one group, this mythical group, Zionists, support Israel but oppose basically a white Israel, is that true? I don't know. Maybe they don't poll. They don't take polling data. They'll find a few statements by a few people, by a few professors or whatever, and it's just dumb. It's just dumb at this point. That's all I wanted to say about Israel. Yeah.